Bonjour, je m'appelle Tom Sanders, je suis directeur du département stratégie de perspective et je vous souhaite la bienvenue à ce cycle de séminaires organisé autour du concept de densité urbaine. Ik wens u van harte welkom op deze reeks van seminars die georganiseerd worden in het kader van het themajaar over stedelijke dichtheid. Comme vous le savez peut-être, Perspective est l'opérateur de la région de Bruxelles-Capitale, chargé de définir une stratégie de développement territorial pour Bruxelles. Perspective s'appuie sur le travail d'experts statistiques et d'experts territoriaux pour réaliser des diagnostics précis, mettre en évidence les enjeux urbains et définir les cadres stratégiques et réglementaires du développement de la région. De opdrachten situeren zich op alle niveaus, van stratenblokken tot de grootstedelijke of zelfs Europese ruimte. En op alle niveaus zijn de voorwaarden dezelfde. Een diagnose verfijnen, de stedelijke problematieken belichten, een visie bepalen en daarna een strategie uitstippelen om die visie te vertalen in concrete stadsprojecten en het leven van de Brusselaars te veranderen. Door deze weg te volgen heeft Perspectief het gewestelijk plan voor duurzame ontwikkeling opgesteld, dat in 2018 door de Brusselse regering werd goedgekeurd. Het GPDO, zoals we het noemen, is eigenlijk het Brusselse stadsproject. Een mijlpaal en een aaneensluiting van projecten en energieën om vorm te geven aan een duurzame en inclusive stad. De quelle ville avons-nous besoin demain? C'était la question posée au moment de réfléchir sur le projet de ville bruxellois. Et c'est la question qui se pose aujourd'hui, plus que jamais, au moment de mesurer l'impact de la pandémie sur le fonctionnement des centres urbains. Et ce, alors que les enjeux climatiques doivent faire l'objet de réponses structurées, globales, transversales, volontaristes. Dans ce contexte, le concept de densité fait débat. Quelle forme, quelle intensité, quels équilibres trouver pour garantir la qualité de vie en ville? C'est la recherche que nous voulons mener dans le cadre de la mission Projecting.brussels pour poursuivre la dynamique autour du projet de ville bruxellois. Et c'est dans ce cadre que nous aurons le plaisir de nous retrouver tous les mardis pendant 6 mois avec des experts venant des 4 coins du monde. Je vous souhaite une excellente soirée.
Je m'appelle Julia Pancratio, je suis chargée de mission Projecting.brussels. Le projet de ville, le plan régional de développement durable, a été approuvé en 2018. Elle constitue la vision de développement de la région sur le moyen et long terme et représente en conséquence les cadres du projet de ville bruxellois. Il tâche de mettre en cohérence un certain nombre d'actions, initiatives, objectifs ou de projets concrets pour former une trajectoire commune au bout de laquelle Bruxelles doit devenir une ville de proximité durable, moderne et inclusive. Le projet de ville constitue de 4 axes majeurs de travail. Construire une armature territoriale, développer un cadre de vie agréable, durable, attractif, développer une économie urbaine, favoriser le déplacement multimodal durable. Perspective étant poursuivre la dynamique autour du projet de ville et garantir qu'il puisse à tout moment faire fonction de cadre général pertinent capable de rendre cohérent entre eux les projets ou les stratégies sectorielles de nombreux acteurs de la ville. C'est l'essence de la mission Projecting.brussels, dans le cadre lequel Perspective souhaite mettre en place une planification stratégique dynamique, c'est-à-dire un processus d'actualisation continue du projet de ville en fonction de l'évolution de la situation socio-économique et des problématiques urbaines sur lesquelles le projet de ville et le proposer ses solutions. Cette mission se structure autour de 3 axes de travail. Un suivi annuel et transversal d'évolution contextuelle de la région, le pilotage d'une concertation des acteurs régionaux chargés de la mise en œuvre des projets de ville, la réflexion pratique et prospective sur les thématiques des projets de ville. Cette année, donc, la réflexion pratique et prospective se traduit par l'organisation d'une année thématique sur les questions de densité urbaine. L'objectif de cette réflexion est de définir plus concrètement les conditions qui permettent de combiner densité urbaine et la qualité de vie dans les quartiers. Dans ce cadre-là que nous retrouvons aujourd'hui avec ce webinaire, je passe les paroles au curateur de l'année thématique densité, Jérôme Baratier. Jérôme, c'est à vous.
Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Je suis Jérôme Baratier, le curateur qui accompagne Perspective.brussels dans cette réflexion autour du lien entre densité et qualité de vie. Alors pourquoi s'intéresser à la densité? Probablement parce qu'à Bruxelles, comme ailleurs, la question de la densité est d'une des controverses urbaines les plus vives. Elle est souvent convoquée par les documents d'urbanisme et encore plus souvent décriée ou condamnée par les habitants. Ce que nous vous invitons à faire, c'est ensemble essayer de définir une densité qui rimerait avec qualité de vie. Et pour ce faire, il faut élargir le spectre que l'on entend à la densité. Il ne s'agit plus d'opposer densité bâtie et nature, il ne s'agit plus d'opposer usage et mixité. Il s'agit aujourd'hui de parvenir à une densité qui rime avec qualité. Alors, pour ce faire, nous vous avons proposé une saison de webinaires. Nous en sommes ce soir au 5e épisode, qui permettent d'entendre des experts qui chacun nous partagent avec vous leur point de vue sur une densité qui rimerait avec qualité de vie. Alors ce soir, nous avons le grand plaisir d'accueillir Eran Chen, qui est le fondateur de l'agence ODA, une agence d'architecture new-yorkaise qui, à Moscou, à Rotterdam et beaucoup à New York, a mis en pratique une forme de densité qui respire, des structures bâties qui offrent des usages multiples, l'hybridation des fonctions et qui permettent finalement de rendre la densité respirable pour les personnes qui sont les usagers de ces bâtiments. Avant d'écouter Eran et de pouvoir échanger avec vous, je vous invite à prendre votre smartphone pour l'habituel sondage qui nous permet de connaître l'auditoire qui est réuni ce soir. À tout de suite.
OK, so thank you very much. Je vais d'abord vous demander, Monsieur Gros, d'éteindre votre caméra. Merci. So this is basically welcome to the little Mentimeter questions we're going to have for you guys. So please take your smartphones and use a QR code right there or enter the code 4909-9055. And we will have a couple of questions for you in order to have a bit of a better understanding of who is taking part at this webinar. At the moment, we have 64 persons. I guess the sun is So the first little question we will ask the audience, if you're ready. So from which city are you from? Première question, de quelle ville venez-vous? So the usual suspects. So it's a lot from Brussels, Paris, New York City, some from Tours in France. It's only 19 people who answered. Let's wait till we have at least half of the persons that answer, at least 30. We have two B's. That's an interesting place to come from. Toulouse, Ghent, Antwerpen. Couple more people answering our questions. We only have 26 answers so far. Personne d'autre? Bon, on va pouvoir passer à la... We can still wait a bit or we can go to the next question. So, que représentez-vous? Who do you represent? Public services, private, academics? Okay, so it's quite an interesting mix. We have more than half, a lot of academics, private partners, more than half of them. Okay, very good. I think we can go to the next question. So more specific questions regarding today's presentation from Eran. So what's the importance is qualitative architecture for density? I guess a lot of people are going to say that's quite a priority. I guess that's something that we're going to be able to answer later on after watching all the example of projects Eran made. I guess it's pretty essential, especially coming from people that are specialized in these matters. Okay, I guess we can go to the next question. So what are the most relevant characteristics of architecture for quality density? So here we're asking you to write in a couple of one word or two. We are waiting for the possibility to write the answers. Open space, there we start. And that's the translation. Soundproofing, that's interesting. That's a very good point. I think we'll talk about that later on. Functionality, consultation. Oh, that is very interesting. I think that's a good cloud. Sobriety. I guess that's to do with the soundproofing. Okay, I think Eran, that's quite an interesting cloud of words we have here. Public space, typology. Okay, that's pretty.
Very interesting. Seems like an educated group of people about
Indeed.
the topic. Light and air, mix of uses.
Integrating nature, spatial diversity, conviviality. Okay, great. I think that already starts a bit. We're already starting in the subject here. I think we can now. I don't know if that was the last question. Ah, yes, of course. Here. So out of these 3 images from projects from Eran's firm, which one is basically the one that you recognize as the most relevant to quality density? Yeah, the middle image is also always quite
Je suis en train de rejoindre un Alors, je vais m'éclipser. Attends.
Oui, est-ce que je pourrais rappeler aux participants d'éteindre leur caméra et leur micro, s'il vous plaît? Un grand merci. Please do not forget to turn your camera and microphone off. The new sentence of the 21st century. Okay, well, maybe if you could tell us later on a bit more about the project number B in the B, Eran, it'll be interesting to see why people are so, maybe it's because they see trees, I guess.
Maybe it's the best rendering.
Thank you very much for this this participation. And now I'd like to welcome Eran Chen. Welcome to Brussels. Welcome in 2D world. And here is Mr. Tom Sanders, our well-beloved director. We can see you. How do you do, boss? Anyway, Eran, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicolas. Thank you, Tom, I guess, Jerome and Julia. It's quite amazing what you guys are working on. And it's a blessing to see, because there's no good outcome without a good plan. And it seems like you're looking to create a good plan. Allow me to share my screen, and let's see that works. Please tell me that you can see it.
Yes,
can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So I wish I was there with you in person in Brussels. The situation of our world is quite different, but I'm here in my office in New York City. Arguably, you could say that New York City is the city of density and intensity, and there's no better place as an architect, I feel, to study and explore architecture can impact our quality of life within a densified city. Right at the center, looking at our latest project in Times Square, New York, where we perhaps kind of push the limit and extend the barrier of access of public space to a vertical experience. We're essentially a linear vertical park, what we call the skyline, would connect coffee shops and restaurants and gathering spaces, performance center and conferences. But before we get into all of that, maybe as a way of introduction, I want to say about my firm, ODA, that we've been exploring the territories by which buildings can breathe, what we call the breathing room of buildings, territories that we can discover ways to expand our life and improve the qualities of our lives, starting at the very generic unit of living, is it apartments, to a building, to a block, and to a neighborhood. And it all started for me almost 20 years ago when I arrived to New York, basically with kind of the vision of Jane Jacobs about the beauty in neighborhoods in New York, where there's a blur between the lines of privacy, intimacy, community, and public spaces, and how simple elements of architecture, like a window, a thick door, or a stoop of stairs, can become platform for these kind of situations to be created, and how architecture can generate life that is, it's one, intimate, familiar, but at the same token, diverse and public. And so what we go through at ODA is trying to imitate and maybe improve on these qualities as city continues to densify, and those moments of intimacy at the streets are disappearing more and more so. And we've done about 55, we completed about 55 projects in New York City, and we're working internationally and around the world in diversifies of programs and scale and geography. But what unites all of our work is the kind of unrelentless desire to find formulas that improve people's life in cities on every kind of function or every aspect of our lives. In order to understand better what we do, I'd like to introduce this fellow, Benoit Mandelbrot, who was a mathematician who in 1982, when I was 12 years old, came up with this book, The Fractal Geometry of Nature. And essentially what he says is that in nature, there's bodies that are geometrical bodies that are subdivided into smaller and smaller fragments. Each fragment is almost identical to the overall shape over a series of different scales. And so essentially there's sort of a loop of repetitive of these forms as they grow and grow and grow and become part of nature. And some examples of that could be the forest, where the structure of the leaf essentially imitates or almost similar to the structure of the branch, the tree, and then the forest itself. Or if you think of water, creeks of water bodies as they move and unite into bigger and bigger, from the little creeks in our backyard to, this is a picture of Myanmar Delta areas by NASA from space. And clearly, you know, the cauliflower, the Italian cauliflower, is an element of such. Now, this idea of fractality has been adopted by architects throughout history, not only because it's beautiful, but also because it was proven in research that it creates a sense of calmness. It reflects a familiarity for people and allow them to kind of be well-oriented within their environment. And perhaps that goes back to the days of humanity in the savannas, where people could find a place of hidden and safetiness while being able to see the biggest picture and get orientation of the landscape. And so Frank Lloyd Wright, for example, built this house where from the pattern of the floors, to the column, the structures, the furniture, to the building itself, fractality is in play. And so we really like the idea of fractality in city and the way that it could kind of reflect these qualities on human. And when we were asked to convert this fairly ugly building on the East River in a neighborhood called Dumbo in Brooklyn, we've discovered that the building used to be a sugar refinery built by a Breckle brothers in the turn of the century. And it was actually double the size. So sugar cane would come from Brazil on the East River, would download their product. The sugar the cane would be refined and then continue north to Chicago through the Hudson River. And we were sort of intrigued by the idea of the fractal of a sugar crystal and proposed a facade that is highly fractal in a three-dimensional kaleidoscope, if you will, that reflects the East River and Manhattan on the other side and adds a new level of complexity to an interchanging neighborhood with an adaptive reuse of an older building. And we love that idea, and especially, you know, the way that the modern kind of fractality adds to the overall context of the building on the waterfront. But then we thought fractality in cities can go way beyond the geometrical form. What if we start looking at that as an expansion of human interactions, social interactions across different scales? What if we can start look at fractality from the most generic unit of living, the organization by which the apartment allows the family to interact, to the neighbors within a building, all the way to a block and a city. And what you see here is our entire office kind of visiting a job site before a building was completed, trying to explore the ability of interactions within that particular structure. And it's funny because the building clearly was sold and considered very successful. But this idea of fractality reminded us something that is quite the opposite of high density. This is a picture of Bailia village in Zambia in Africa. And here the settlers, without an architect, without an urban planner, came up with a brilliant plan of fractile organization that repeats itself both formally and organically, but also as a social structure for their community. You have a one-family hut that comes in different scales, a studio, a one-bedroom, a three bedrooms, etc. A cluster of those creates kind of a building, and then the neighborhood and the entire settlement, while the neighbors, the clusters of neighbors are sharing a common courtyard where the kids are playing and the families are familiar. And then together they're sharing bigger spaces, and then ultimately a huge space that is shared for the cattle and the entire community. So we're thinking, what if we take that idea and flip it and think about it as a building within Manhattan, such that the level of fractality would break the mold of the repetitive floor plates that just goes in forever and start create fragments of sort of small units of life that makes our life within building richer. About 10 years ago, we discovered a small, very simple discovery that the zoning rules in New York City can allow us to take a typical building with a setback and rearrange what's called the dormer into sort of a random placement of fractal units. This, we thought, would allow us to increase the amount of outdoor space at the top of the building, create very unique apartments, expand the amount of exposure to natural light and air and outdoor spaces. And so we've taken that kind of fractal facade that is repeating into bigger and bigger chunks and create voids within the building itself that we can insect our life into, and created homes that act more like a private house than maybe an apartment. Multiply exposures, cross viewing between different rooms through the outdoor space, and such kind of infusion of indoor outdoor that improves not only light and air, but also accessibility to biophilia. And we thought that this idea is quite powerful. And can we now duplicate it or build it on the extent of the entire building? We took the generic unit of a room, which is basically how, our most intimate form of living, in a project here in Dumbo, right by the Manhattan Bridge, and then compose them in a way that not only expands the apartment's access to light and air, but also create this kind of mutual territory between the neighbors that starts to create visual connection and physical connection between different units and partners of the building itself. That expression of kind of captured outdoor space within a building by expansion of the envelope, we tried it in many different forms. This is a building we've done in Washington, D.C. And here we've basically pushed one corner of the building, as you can see on the left, to create this fan-like openness that starts as a small balcony into a very deep terrace. And the nice thing here, beyond the expansion of the units themselves and the sharing feeling of the neighbors, is the way that the buildings start to communicate with its immediate environment. So right across the street from here, there's a big stadium where they play baseball. And so not only that the neighbors could kind of enjoy a sense of community in a more kind of intimate fractality, the building itself, as it cantilevers over to the other side, create this enclosure, intimacy for the tenants of the building itself through this garden, and then eventually opens up to the city itself, to the ballpark, and create this kind of personal connection between people at their home, their neighbors, and the community in large of the city. So what happens when we look farther from the individual building? What happens when we look at a city block and we start developing these ideas where when we had to design this building in Bushwick, Bushwick is a neighborhood in Brooklyn, it brought high density to a low density community. And we were asked to design 1,200 apartment buildings over 2 city blocks. Now, if you look at a typical New York City city block, it's sort of a donut. And what we proposed is to further break it down into smaller segments that creates inner blocks within the block. Each one is a courtyard on an intimate scale. They're all interconnected at the ground floor and at the center connected to a public park. The roof of the entire thing became a huge 60,000 square foot, which is 6,000 square meter or about, of a community park. So we have the public park, we have the weaving of the pedestrian courtyards, and we have the community park. And that level of fragmentation, if you will, that fractality that grows into the city block allowed us to really compose intimate courtyards that are only for the pedestrians, both the building citizens and the public community around that they're invited into this ground floor. And at this point, we started thinking that the traditional attitude to ground floor as retail, as a moneymaker for developers, should be totally changed. And the future ground floor should be composed of the needs of the neighborhood, creating value to what's above us. And this sequence of courtyards allow people to wander around in a sense of familiarity in different scales and different scales of group to create communities and socialize as they wish. Now, when we start looking at big buildings, we also look at big corridors. And corridor is one of the worst architectural feature of modern architecture. We used to pay much more attention to corridors in historical forms of history. And today it's just a conveyor. They allow us to go as efficiently as possible into our apartment. And we thought, how can we break that experience by bringing glass in the corridor into these courtyards, create visual connection now, bring natural light, break the journey, and then use the wall of the corridor as a canvas to create mega art within the project. And we've basically invited 13 local artists to create mega murals by hand painting them on the walls, tell the story of the community through its characters and through its culture that is imprinted within our building and shared with the public through those openings in the corridor. So this idea that a building could be much more, a residential building, a housing building can be much more than just places where people have an apartment. The roof itself is an amazing landscape in amazing scale, but also broken into moments like urban farming. We have a greenhouse, mini golf, and just moments of visual kind of contemplation with New York City at the background. So now we start seeing an overlap on a bigger scale, on a block scale, between the fractal quality of each apartment to those pockets of interaction, to idea of breaking the corridors, to overlap with public museum. And essentially, the question is how people feel within the building. And we continually went back and interviewed people who live in that community. 20% of the apartments are affordable housing. They are mixed equally inside the building. And we were quite astonished to see how pleasantly people explore the building, not as necessarily a place that they just live in, but sort of as a place of experiment and exploration and sort of social connection. I want to step one scale up and share with you a study that we've done for a place called the Flower District, not too far from my office, at the heart of New York. And this is a movie that tells the story itself, so I'm just going to play it. Oh, no sound. Anybody hear sound? No? Are you guys there?
You have
Yes.
to click on the volume on the right there, no?
Yes.
Ah, there you go. Thank you.
There is no sound there, Ron, I'm afraid.
No sound?
No, I'm very sorry about that. It worked earlier on. I don't know what happened.
That's okay. So I'm going to just narrate it myself for you guys. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So while cities are expanding all over the world and super tall structures dominate our skyline, there's an increasing importance to reactivate our urban cores and improve people's life at the street level. We looked at the historical Flower District, located in the crossroad of iconic city landmarks and public parks in the heart of Manhattan, where community and commerce once flourished. This neighborhood, once filled with hundreds of flower vendors, has been struggling in the past few decades. As traffic and cars have come to overpower pedestrians, it has become very hard to maintain a sustainable social and economic urban fabric. While the typical streets are not enough to sustain a new density, existing city blocks have hidden courtyards that are privately owned and are underutilized. We propose a new city regulation that will encourage developers to bestow interior courtyards and create new connections to the streets in exchange for an increase in floor area and height. As a result, the privately owned will be open to the public. Now imagine a typical block, where over time these spaces being created and passageways are connecting them to the street, and the ground floor starts to flourish with functions like markets, small businesses, coffee shop, diversity of housing, hospitality, urban farming, public art, and that would expand the public realm and create a new experience. The new green web of environment will link to one another between the blocks and expand over time. And so what you see here in the video is an opening within the city block into currently is a privately
More clear, who's a
that will become public in return for light and air at the top. The retail at the ground floor now has not only the street front, but it has the courtyard front that is totally pedestrian and could be shared by communities based on the way that they're programmed. From art galleries to urban farms to food and beverage, educational facilities for young kindergartens, after school activities, etc. This is an opportunity to create an expansion of what the streets cannot contain anymore. Now, the beauty about these gardens, they become three-dimensional in the way they engage with the neighbors around. We have windows of the neighbors looking inward, like a typical European courtyard, but the linkage to the grid system of Manhattan allow us to enjoy both and not choose one or the other. As you can see with the film, we have not finished it yet, but that idea could over time expand and extend in the Flower District and beyond Manhattan. And just an idea of how to utilize unused spaces within our urban fabric without changing it. I want to touch a little bit upon a familiar topic called the structure of a tower. Towers are very weird new forms of modern architecture, because essentially what they do is they take a number of people that used to be a small community, and they basically pile them up as a vertical stack, neglecting two things. One, the urban amenities that we used to have as part of our everyday life, the local barber, the dog run, the little park, the pub. And second, eliminating our ability to have democratic and free circulation, replacing it with a dead-end corridors and elevator system. So can we start think about towers as a neighborhood that is flipped 90 degrees, a structure that is vertical in high density and small footprint, yet allows to combine those urban facilities of that particular neighborhood within different levels of the tower, and allows somehow to create a circular circulation that is more free. And we were asked to design a very large tower in San Francisco at an area on Market Street between the downtown and sort of the sprawl of the neighborhoods on the other side. And we were thinking, instead of building two towers on a podium, can we connect the two towers and create horizontal connections at different levels that would house those urban amenities that we used to on a flat neighborhood, but also create a free circulation between the two cores and the passing through. And that building shape, essentially, which we call the Twin Peaks above the Golden Gate Bridge, starts suggesting a new form of neighborhood living within a building, and essentially saying a tower that houses 2,000 people is not just a building. A tower with 2,000 people is a neighborhood. We have different experiments in different towers. This is a tower, the tallest tower in downtown LA we're designing, where while simple, it combines all of the amenities as a sort of community facility at the mid-level of the tower. allowing every person within the building to explore these amazing views, but also create those pockets again of fractal communities and create a visual connection with the rest of the city. And in Seattle, we're designing a park, a community park that is elevated at mid-level and frame Mount Rainier and Mount St. Helens and the Puget Sound on 360 degrees with amenities of the building and create this kind of new experience of park in the sky. So how does it all come together when we start look on an urban scale, when we're looking at more than one building, more than one block? I want to share a master plan that we're doing in Queens. It's basically 5 city blocks that are currently either parking lots or single-story factory buildings. Most of them are vacant in an existing neighborhood called Astoria. And the first thing we thought was how we can accommodate the needs of the neighborhood, of the entire community at large, at the ground, the very narrow streets, and the retail along the street. We dedicated out of the privately owned property, all of these green spaces in different scales that becomes a string of experiences that would share but the community at large, from a large park to a marketplace, an urban plaza, pedestrian plazas, gallery gardens, kids' playrooms, etc. Now, what's important is not just to dedicate the area, but then dedicate the entire ground floor as a program that serves this community at large and not necessarily just serves the bottom line, with the view that for the developments in the future, the value would come above because of the livelihood and the strength of the neighborhood. So it will have retail, but it would have smaller components of mom and pop shops. It would have educational facility and kids areas. It would have culture and also a lot of sustainable factors. Essentially, you can say that it would include a sustainability with 3 different buckets: the environmental one, economic sustainability for the surrounding neighborhood, and definitely the social sustainability. So if you start taking a journey, a look at these kind of 3 buckets, how they interweave within the urban fabric, and then how they interweave within the entire massing as it goes vertically, we start recognizing the fractal elements as they grow and grow within our city, from the small unit and their outdoor space to the entire building, the communities on the green roofs, the courtyards that kind of allow different scales of intimacy into the bigger park. And if I go through a journey into this proposed neighborhood, there's discoveries along the typical streets where the street opens up into areas of communal gathering. And it's really important to say that density is what allows this quality to exist. These courtyards would be empty unless the density above would revive it 24/7. And it's also important to program the different spaces to allow for that interaction from office to hospitality, housing, cultural institution, educational institutions, etc. Here are the small family gardens, the kids' playground surrounded by childcare, and then the Zen garden surrounded by adult school, library, and coffee shops. In between those, you see the typical street. Now, all of these are surrounded again with a mixture of programs. Here is the passageway that includes small retail shops that could be affordable for local business owners to maintain and sustain economical stability over
Donc ça va, je suis au bureau.
the bigger green lawns for that particular neighborhood that opens up to a large-scale cultural institution in a partnership with educational facilities that are in the area to create this kind of a culture event, indoor, outdoor, around the year activation. And on the east side of the development, the commercial zone, where we have an open market that is also covered to be used around the year. And that links into the sort of civic plaza where most of the offices buildings are, the business center, and the cinema. So I'd like to finish with a project that perhaps is closer to most of you. It's a project that is under construction right now in Rotterdam. It's going to be our first completed project in Europe. We're working on a few more currently. And what I love about Rotterdam is, to me, it resembles so much about New York in many ways. First of all, historically, on the corner, the tip here at Hotel New York, ships used to sail after World War II from the Netherlands to New York and build many of the neighborhoods that we know of today in Manhattan. And then because of the history of this city that was bombed to the ground, there's a new sort of generation of density, and the city is looking for right formulas. We were asked to design, or actually we've won a competition, redesign the old post office, which is situated between the city hall and the financial center. And the post office is an historical important building because it's one of the only structures that remained intact after the bombing of World War II. It's a national and city landmark, but it's sitting empty for almost 12 years. And the idea was to combine a renovation of the beauty of the historical structure that used to be a beehive for people coming into this great telegraph room, and revive it again with a new program. And the way we propose to do it is by creating a connection from that great hall through the building to a new courtyard we created all the way to the other side, essentially connecting two urban rooms between the main street, which is called Kulsingel, to the street at the back, which is called Rodezan, where OMA has done a museum that is right now not in the mainstream passageway. And if you look at the program of the building, it's a mixed use of commercial in red, residential in blue, and hotel in green. There's also offices and convention center. And the idea of the diagram in the left is how we meticulously program these things that will create activation of those big open spaces throughout the year and throughout the day. And hopefully this beautiful duality between kind of all the new, would kind of encourage people to pass through the building. And here you see the facade as the building lands and the architecture that is inspired by its historical part. And then as the tower on top of it kind of rise up, it's a tower that is core on foundations are conceptually were lended through the historical feature of the building itself, but it's a very fracted and airy structure that promotes the idea of fractality, open space, natural light, a combination of this territory of shared airspace between the neighbor, and perhaps kind of a new form of living for a city that develops its density on the foundation of its history. And as we look at this fly through, I just like to kind of summarize by saying that I believe that the only way that we're going to live as humanity in peace with Mother Earth is that we continue and expand the areas on the planet that are wild, and we continue to consolidate and concentrate in big cities. By 2050, there's going to be 11 billion people on this planet. And it's not just a choice, it's a matter of importance that we condense all of us in big cities. But we have to find the forms to do it in a way that would not only sustain us, but expand our horizons and give us both physical and mental health, improve our qualities of life with access to culture and other people, but sustain our social structure in the way that we kind of intimately connect to our environment and to one another. what you see here is the exit from the new formed courtyard into the new entrance of the tower. You see the historical post office next door, and then the sponge-like character of the tower itself that allows winds to pass through it, the outdoor spaces to collect water that can be used as a gray water, and to have a new expression of life for a physical vertical structure that represents perhaps the futures of city. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening.
Well, thank you so much, Eran. That was very, very interesting indeed. Plenty of questions already from our public, but once again, thank you for a beautiful presentation and great renderings indeed.
Thank you.
You have some great artists working for you. So Jérôme and Julia have been kind enough during this talk to edit and curate some of the questions from their part and from our listeners. So I'll start first of all, Jérôme, I'll start. So basically regarding, so let's go back now to that building. It was called the Denizen building in Bushwick. Is that right?
Right. Yeah.
So the question really is about, you know, now we have to go to the more pragmatic questions regarding all those ways of seeing how we develop and build in the future. So, for example, that building, the Denizen, who can use these spaces? Is it only the co-propriety? And who pays and maintains them, for example?
So the developer, essentially the owner, has to build them, pay for them, and maintain them. However, and not only the courtyards, but also the park in the center. However, 4 out of 6 will be open to the public throughout the day. So essentially, people from the neighborhood who cross between the 2 blocks in the park could come down into those courtyards. In fact, we have a restaurant, we have a coffee shop, we have a supermarket in one of those courtyards, so people can hang out and play. But it's important to point out that these are curated, where some of the spaces at the courtyards are public or commercial, and some of them are amenities. And so we were blurring the line between what belongs to the building and what belongs to the public. And we got some resistance conceptually in the beginning to that idea because of issues of security and access way, but the reality is quite different. People are, you know, by and large, respecting elements of security like you have in a lobby, and everybody's enjoying this urban amenities, both the people of the building and the entire neighborhood. Now,
Okay.
one might ask, how do you convince a developer to pay and sustain it? And the answer, and that's the key answer that we need to think about, the value of what happens above has increased so much. I said that 20% of the apartments are affordable, but 80% of the apartments are market rate, and they're rented at the highest price in the market space in Brooklyn. So people are desired to live in a situation like that, and it's worthwhile for the developers to invest the money to give up sort of the high income yield from the ground floor in order to create a better community above.
And was it difficult to convince the developer to have 20% affordable? Was that by law?
That was by law,
Okay.
and that's the law that should, in my mind, continue and be on every building in every city. I think that's the only way to resolve the issue of affordability in cities. And most importantly, you know, what we've seen in affordable housing projects here in New York, but everywhere in the world, is that they're done in the most remote and less desirable areas of the city. They just, you know, cement the idea of rich and poor and have-nots. But if we can fragment percentage of every building we build in our cities, in return to whatever the city formula is, bonuses, FAR, whatever it is, then we can have a sustainable community over time.
Okay, great. And so to come back regarding the questions of density after having come about a bit about inclusion, but we'll get back to the inclusion questions more because, of course, here in Brussels, the market rate is definitely not the same as in New York City. But regarding density, in order to be more to energy sobriety, is that also accessible to all, or is that putting the costs higher if you want to use less energy?
Can you repeat the question again? I'm sorry, Nicholas.
It's really regarding density and energy sobriety. Is that accessible to all?
The energy?
Yeah.
What do you mean the energy?
I mean how the building uses energy.
Well, I mean the buildings by code in New York City have to adhere to a minimum sustainable regulations. I don't think they're good enough. I think a lot of our buildings are reaching beyond the minimum requirement, but I think we're all moving towards that. We have to make sure that our energy codes are quite strict, that we're landscaping our roofs, that we're collecting water, that we're using more and more renewable energies from photovoltaic panels to wind to other means. So that's something that goes without saying. This is something that we have to do regardless, and we can talk about that for an hour separately.
Of course, yeah, regarding urban heat islands and so on. I mean, that's another vast question. Regarding density also, do we need to build everywhere? What do you think about de-densification, about opening up? And you had a great example in your
what do I think in general about opening up cities to increasing of density? Yeah, I think it's the right thing to do, and I try to break my question into my answer into two. First of all, I truly believe that that's the only way we can sustain ourselves over time. Living in cities is more sustainable for the planet. It leaves more open space for nature, and it creates less strength of utilities and infrastructure. So that's one thing. Second, I think the quality of the public realm can actually be increased if we combine the right program for density with the right increasement of the sort of the urban fabric. There's many places in Europe that they have the opposite problem than New York. For example, Rotterdam, the streets are not active enough. The streets in most places are dominated by cars. People are driving their bike, but there's not much pedestrian activity in the majority of the city spaces. So bringing density would help, but we have to be careful that we're not just continuing and relying on the sidewalk and the street retail as our only means to create community interactions, and we consistently play with change of program, expand areas, and mixed use in everything that we do.
Okay, great. So to come back a bit more about the heat effect and the climate issues, of course, regarding urban heat islands, that will probably be the main issue in the coming years. How can architecture of such a huge footprint contribute to prevent it?
Well, first of all, the roof areas, we should do better than the land that we're taking. So if our building footprint, let's say, is X amount of hectares that we've taken, we should make sure that the building provides an increased amount of outdoor space as an accumulation from the footprint that we've taken. That means not just the roof itself, but those terraces that we provide throughout, and even the overlapping of terraces, like I showed in some of my buildings, creates an opportunity for bigger outdoor spaces. The roofs must be landscaped to a certain degree or be public. And actually, there's a new rule and regulation in New York, and I'm sure Europe has similar rules, that you cannot have a roof that does either or. It's either green or planted with collection of water, or it's dedicated for public engagement. And I think that when I say public, it could be communal, but there's no surfaces that are left behind untaken care of, with black surfaces that increase the heat island. Each area is either landscaped, planted, or used for gathering.
Okay, so continuing this question of nature and biodiversity, we're really interested in these questions. I mean, they are so important. If you could elaborate more about your efforts, ODA's effort to maintain and improve urban biodiversity?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, about 7 years ago, we've decided that biodiversity and landscape is inseparable from architecture and design. And we've created a landscape department within our firm ODA. And not because we don't trust other landscape companies to come along, but because landscape too often is an afterthought on development. Meaning to say, quite often architects would design their buildings, and then later on, landscapers would come in and plant the leftover spaces. We decided that every concept idea that we have has to integrate with the idea of biodiversity and landscape from the get-go. They're inseparable. And that's how we've managed to, for example, in Bush Week, we've done the entire landscape on the roof, on all the private terraces. We're doing the landscape in most of our projects. The other thing is promote the idea of landscape within the private houses and community. And for that, we encourage the idea of urban farming and greenhouses. I don't know how many people are familiar with hydroponic planting. I think hydroponic planting is the future of
we have Holland next door, so we know about it.
Right. So it's the future of agriculture. But it could be done in smaller quantities. And clearly the idea of people having access to planting in their facility, in their roof, in their amenities, I think would increase the desire to plant and be surrounded by planting in your immediate environment.
Okay, great. I'm still looking at some other questions from our public here. Just a moment. So yeah, here it's really also about a green roof is not the equivalent of vegetation in real ground. It seems that these issues, an example, maintaining of existing vegetation grounds and improving ecological corridor, are not still at the center of the reflection. But I guess you answered that with regarding taking biodiversity into your pre-planning.
Yeah, and also let's not forget, planting is not the only thing. Collecting of water and using gray water is another thing, or using roof as a retainer or retainage of water is another element that creates both insulation, but also creates a form of collections that, to use as gray water within the building itself. So all of these systems has to collapse and overlap together. I think the point is that every surface that is vertically open has to be treated. And that's not something that I think we see in most of our cities currently. Definitely, if you look at New York City from above, the majority of the roofs are just mechanical spaces or they're empty. Yeah. So we need to take over these spaces. And if we do, including these courtyards idea that I just shared, these are neglected spaces right now. Most of them are, storage or mechanical equipment. If we can take over, then we can plant the layering systems of collection of water, biophilia, or areas of gathering.
Okay, great. And regarding the activity of ground floors, which is so important in the heart of the process of your planning and projects, have you kind of an idea? Have you had a forethought of the number of housing necessary to create an urban life at the ground floor? Is there like a critical mass needed by block?
Well, I don't have the numbers, and it's a tricky question, but it's an interesting one.
It's from Jerome. He always does tricky questions.
I know, Jerome, you're a tricky guy. But I do want to say something that I think is very important. We've been pushing developers for maybe 10 years to change their allocation of value.
Mike.
You can't hear me? You can't hear me? No? Yes?
Yes, it's okay.
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 It's okay.
Thank you. So we've been trying to convince the private sector, the developers for a long time to change the value allocated to the ground floor from what they have in the Excel sheets, right? When they think of a price, they say, okay, this is going to be retail and it's going to be value X. And part of the problem in the past generation is, especially in cities core, where there's increased density, the value of this has gone up to a place where only like high-end stores can live, right, and survive. And that's not sustainable for most of us, because there are other programs that we need at the ground floor that are perhaps not as, not as profitable for the developers. But what happened is a huge opportunity right now. Even before COVID, the declination of the retail value because of Amazon and online shopping have changed the perception of street shopping in many, many places. It's not valid anymore. At the global scale, yes, some places it's going to be still great. At the global scale, the idea of going down to buy something at the store has now been questioned. So we have to change. This is a pivotal point that is a huge opportunity for us to say, no, guys, the value is not at the ground floor from a money standpoint. Creating a neighborhood activity is your value, which is above the ground floor. Let's think together what we can do at the street level that is totally new, that has programs that has
Non, je ne sais pas, je vais...
that has to do with education. As I said, I feel like urban farming would be an amazing element in the ground floor as well, harvesting and shopping for grocery and produce. But also, just leisure, places of leisure and exploration, increasing of landscape, increasing the sidewalk into the building. So all of these elements and the courtyards that I suggested, cutting through the retail and making more gardens, all of these are happening now. And I think that we have an amazing opportunity if we think creatively about that to take advantage of it.
Of course, yeah. And coming back to the city for all, we are all too well aware that a lot of cities are unaffordable and all that. So what's your point of view regarding this high quality, dense and urban and dynamic life? Is it accessible just for a small percentage?
Well, that's exactly the point. If it's going to be accessible to a small percentage, first of all, it's not equitable, and most of us are going to leave the cities, and we have no access to public. Second, there's no fun in it. And let's be honest, if you look at projects like the Hudson Yard in New York, which, some people think they like it, they hate it, doesn't matter. At the ground floor, as a new neighborhood, its contribution to the public realm is close to zero. And you still have high-end shopping in a shopping mall, and you still have a lot of dormants for fancy hotels and residential. But what they've neglected to do is diversify the ground floor to different programs at different price points that would invite everybody to come in. That would make this neighborhood so much more exciting. And you know what? It would make the value of the towers above even more had they've done that, as opposed to, creating a cold front for only few.
So it's really creating a mixed use, mixed socially inclusive ground floor will make your apartments above at a bigger price in your example, in your expertise.
Absolutely. It would make those neighborhoods more desirable to live in. That's where we want to live. That's where we pay big money to be in. That's where people are going to rent for more. And if we maintain the 20-30% affordability throughout the city, right, we can then balance between desirable neighborhoods that are more valuable in places that are active. We can create a better city life at the floor for everyone, and we can allow for a percentage of our population to have affordability within those great locations.
Okay, great. And so basically, we still have we're going to finish in a couple of minutes, around 20 past, 22 past. we will take the last questions. And to be more technical, I have a question from Julia, from her architecture point of view, regarding the materials you use. Is that a lot taken into account? The sustainability of your materials, your the reuse of material building, as we know, a lot of construction and all that is one of the biggest CO2 emitters. So is that taken into account, the use of the material?
Look, the ideas of recycle economy.
Il y a peu de personnes dans la
Something that is, I believe, is more developed in Europe than in New York. We're trying to catch up. It's not an easy thing to do because of cost and availability. So we're doing the best that we can within, within the realm of our possibilities. But I think, again, I think these are elements that needs to be regulated, because it shouldn't be up to me or you or another architect or developer. If they choose to pay more for, for better, sustainable and reuse type of economy project, it should be regulated as a form of law. And I think it's coming. I mean, we all need to chip into this direction, and eventually it's going to come. You have to be careful. Like in New York City, we're facing really challenge, because the more we spend money on the building itself, and these materials are clearly much more expensive these days, the more we have to elevate, the developer have to elevate the pricing. And part of it is counterintuitive, right? You don't want to do that. You want to continue and create more and more housing that are more accessible and not like super luxury every time. So that's where I think the government needs to intervene. Some of these materials has to be sponsored by government program. And then I think it has to be regulated in rules that would allow all of us to act more responsibly in the materials we use.
Okay, great. And now that we're nearing the end, we're going to have more philosophical questions. Another tricky one from Jérôme, our teacher from Paris, the specialist. So regarding your fractal approach to form and to your building philosophy, so does fragmentation of inner courtyards and blocks, doesn't it just bring about repetition?
Well, it's a good question, Jerome. And I think the beauty of fractality as opposed to repetition is that it occurs across different scales. If you only say, okay, let's just do courtyards all over the place, I mean, I'm not sure it's going to be bad, but it's definitely not addressing the idea of fractality. And the idea of fractality should start at the most generic forms. It's our office, our room, our apartments, then expands to our communities in a building, then to courtyards, then to blocks, then to the way we look at city planning. And that's what I've tried to get across in my lecture. It's not to say that we've achieved all of that successfully. There's ways to go. But if we adopt this idea of fractality, which must have a graduate impact from the millions in the streets to the individual person in the room, the ability to kind of interact with our environment in different scales, that's what I think is missing. And New York is such an extreme example of that. You can live in a glass tower on the 50th floor of a building. You go in the corridor, elevator, and you come out at Fifth Avenue with millions of others. There's no in between. And the only separation today that we have between ourselves and the public realm sometimes is an isolated, insulated glass that is thin 3 centimeters. So part of the idea of the threshold, the architecture as a threshold, and creating pockets that architecturally are transforming one to, indoor to outdoor, individual to community. As they grow in scale, I think that would be the form that I find successful. I hope I answered your question, Jerome.
Well, thank you so much for your time this evening. I think this is going to be a wrap. Once again, I'd like to thank all the participants for being here tonight. Of course, it's a lovely evening here in Brussels, so our numbers were not the ones we were expected, but I understand at some point, There's so much to see out there. Eran, thank you so much. We will put soon this video. We will edit it a bit without the beginning introduction, with the introduction, and we'll put it on the YouTube channel. I hope you'll be able to share it a lot. If Jérôme or Julia doesn't have any last question, I would like to invite everybody to our last. In next month we will have our last webinar. It's still a surprise. We can't say who's going to be yet, but it's going to be more regarding the economy of density in the city. And once again, I'd like to thank everybody to participating. I'd like to thank Eran, Alexandra, Kelly, and Brianna for being here. Of course, it's always a pleasure to chat and exchange on these questions. They are more than ever at the forefront of a lot of deciders, developers, thinkers. And once again, je voudrais vous remercier tous d'avoir participé. Dankjewel voor deze avond. And see you hopefully next month. Have a good evening. Bye bye all.
Thank you, Nicolas. Thank you, Julia.
Bye
Thank you, Jerome.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.